It's April 3rd, so I think it's safe to say now that any Russian winter offensive is either complete or didn't happen. Take your pick. And honestly, the fact that you can make an argument either way really speaks to how effective these last few months were. I think what played out was just an increase in steady state operations rather than an actual offensive, but I'll also get into the argument that these past few months may actually be all that Russia has left. So this is one of those areas where the Russian government never actually said anything about kicking off a major winter offensive. It was just something that was widely assumed by both Western and Russian analysts. And it wasn't crazy to expect something. I mean, generally, operational pace slows during the winter months, but there were a few key factors playing into Russia's favor here. Their mobilization of 300,000 or so took place in the fall, and it was totally reasonable to expect that most of them could get through some modest level of training and join their units around or shortly after the start of the year. We then had the Ukrainian counteroffensive culminate in the fall. Likely at that point, Ukraine was focused on reconstituting their forces and repairing equipment that was damaged in those recent fights. In terms of timing, that window could have been used by Russia to take advantage of a likely exhausted Ukrainian force in a few areas of the country. Finally, and sort of tied in with the previous point, Western equipment was being promised but not yet delivered. Patriots, Bradleys, Abrams, Leopards, and now MiG-29s from a few countries. All of these were on the table or already promised, but the window to arrive in country was immediately set at the spring or summer timeframe. Now, none of this Western equipment on their own is going to drastically alter the fight, but if you're Russia, wouldn't you rather take on Ukraine before they got all this new kit? The answer is yes. Now, I've seen the argument from some Russian analysts that Russia is trying to get NATO to commit some vast amount of their equipment before striking so as to deplete all of the Western arms in one big blow. Look, the U.S. sent, 31 Abrams? We have something like 6,000 operational and in storage. I'd rather those 31 not get destroyed, but it's a rounding error in terms of our overall current set. I made a video previously talking about Michael Kaufman's analysis that what we saw in 5 areas of the front was the Russian offensive and that it just wasn't all that much. I mean, the fighting was intense. I don't want to downplay that or the casualties suffered on each side, but I don't think a few kilometers gained around Avdiivka and Bakhmut is what people had in mind when they threw out the idea of a major Russian offensive. Now, by not announcing anything about an offensive, Russia maintained the ability to say, what are you talking about? These are just normal, everyday operations. And I generally think that's the right action to take. Personally, I feel like Ukraine, on the other hand, as well as much of NATO, hyping up a spring offensive adds unnecessary pressure to an already tense situation. In the worst case, that added public pressure can lead to poor decision-making that costs a fight or even the overall war. So Russia being tight-lipped on their winter plans isn't really unexpected, just contrasts a bit with what we see from the Ukrainian side. Now, at this point, I tend to view these last few months as a sort of an increase in Russian operations, but not necessarily any sort of major offensive. Especially over the last few months, the intensity kicked up in places like Crimea, Avdiivka, Volodar, Marinka, and of course, Bakhmut. I think this was just as much intended to wear down the Ukrainian forces as it was to make any sort of physical progress on the battlefield. Now, I'm not doubting that Russia was trying to push forward. I mean, they were always quick to announce and publicize any sort of gains. I just think that might have been a byproduct rather than their actual goal. The reason I say that is that most of these areas saw attacks that were steady and grinding rather than an overwhelming use of firepower and a massed armored thrust into the lines. Even if you go into some of the bigger attacks like down around Volodar, you're talking about company-size elements, maybe a little bigger at some times, and an offensive in this war is not going to rest on the actions of 50 to 100 person element. Now, I don't think Russia took their foot off the gas, but might have used this time to attempt to further degrade the Ukrainian military, which of course raises the question, was it effective? And time will tell on that front. So there's no doubt that Ukraine had to commit resources to some of these areas that otherwise could have been consolidated for an offensive, but it's impossible to tell from the outside if that was a minor inconvenience or a major issue. Let's quickly pull up some maps to see how things look on the battlefield today. Starting with Bakhmut, the Wagner forces there have recently started pushing directly into the city center in the east, which is a little bit of a change. For a few months now, it looked like the encirclement of the city was the goal, and it very well may still be. That type of maneuver is generally designed to avoid the sort of frontal assault into fortified positions, so it's interesting to see the back and forth between those methods here. It's not crazy that they could do those two things in tandem, push around the edges and hammer on the front just to ensure that Ukrainian forces have to stay committed in multiple directions. Bakhmut is probably the worst of the 5 areas we're going to look at here in terms of what the future weeks and months look like for Ukraine. There's just very little room for error on the western side of the city. If a line there collapses even a little, all elements in the city could quickly find themselves completely isolated and without support. At that point, Ukraine would either need to break through the Russian lines, a task significantly harder than holding the defensive posture they're in now, or risk what is likely a sizable force in Bakhmut being captured or killed. Now, it's worth remembering that Bakhmut has taken on a sort of significance beyond the battlefield. And for both sides, it's been promoted as this massive fight. For Ukraine, it's holding against all odds, and for Russia, it's grinding down this fortress area of the front. And for that reason, there's a little added fog around the decision-making at Bakhmut. I don't mean that in a good way or a bad way, just that there's an aspect here that can't be picked up from map progress or even casualty figures, if we had any idea what those were. I bring that up because both Ukrainian leadership and the leader of the Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, have hinted at a coming Ukrainian counteroffensive in and around Bakhmut. The argument for that would be that Russian forces located there, primarily the Wagner Group, are likely exhausted at this point. And yes, both sides are engaged in heavy fighting, but advancing over new terrain every day takes a different toll than holding the same defensive position for days or even weeks at a time. And if Ukraine were to pull off this maneuver correctly, they'd be able to mass fresh troops against worn-down Wagner forces. Think of it as Ukrainian forces stay in their positions on the line, and an offensive force built up in the rear advances through friendly lines into the fight. At this point, I wouldn't expect the Ukrainian forces that have been at Bakhmut for months to be the actual ones stepping out of the trenches and pushing forward. But again, done correctly, that has the possibility of catching Wagner off guard and not in a position to hold against a sizable force. Now, I'm sure the Russian forces are setting up defenses as they move forward each week, but it takes time to set something up of real impact. And while you're advancing, it's very, very hard to do. Now, I know everyone's already focused on Bakhmut, but I just want to add the possibility there of a Ukrainian counterattack sometime in the spring. Shifting north to Crimea, then we'll head south. This line has been pretty contested for quite a while now. The fighting here is mostly done in forests rather than city streets, so there tends to be a large gap in areas that aren't exactly under the direct control of one side or the other. Crimea is one of the 5 areas that has seen a significant uptick in fighting over the last few months, and most reports put some of the more well-equipped Russian forces in this area. That's prompted a thought that a Russian offensive could be focused here. The idea would be a push towards Izium while securing a northern approach to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. That's in the category of, I'm sure Russia would like that and Ukraine wouldn't, but it doesn't necessarily make it any more or less likely to actually happen in the next few months. Now, while the fighting there has been intense, the conduct of the Russian military in the region tends to look more like a fixing operation than any sort of major offensive that has fallen flat. All right, moving south now, we'll head to Avdiivka. As I mentioned in a recent video, a map view here does not look good for Ukraine. I mean, at no time do you want your forces to look like they could be surrounded. That said, the situation on the ground there hasn't changed much in the last few weeks. For Russia to have made the progress they have to the north and the south, they were clearly taking deliberate offensive action. These don't appear to have been theater-wide coordinated offensive, but more of an uptick in activity that slowly pushed the lines in a few areas around the city. Then Marinka has just been an absolute slugfest. There's like nothing left of that city. The two sides are really just fighting through the ruins. Lines there have also shifted in Russia's favor over the last few months, but these were slow pushes and not a major breakthrough at any specific point. Volodar is the last area I'm going to zero in on here, and it's sort of the outlier. There have been concerted Russian armored pushes here that overall appear to have resulted in failure, but more than the other areas of increased activity, an argument could be made here for a deliberate Russian offensive of sorts. My only hesitation with thinking this is much more than a local commander taking the initiative is the size of the attacks. They just haven't been all that big. So let's get into the alternate point of view here as well. I tend to think that what we've seen play out in Ukraine wasn't a Russian offensive, as many think of one, but rather an increase in activity to wear down Ukrainian forces and take advantage of any localized opportunity to advance. But that opens up the question of why didn't Russia carry out anything larger scale? There's always the vague, it's coming statement from many Russian analysts, but at this point, personally, I got to see it to believe it. Up until about July, I did think another major Russian offensive would kick off, a reconstituted force, pulling in more forces from elsewhere in the country, actually taking the Ukrainian resistance seriously. That just hasn't really happened. And the idea that Russia is just holding back doesn't really carry much weight in my personal opinion anymore. The only holding back that I think can be seriously considered right now is their use of weapons of mass destruction. There is another argument that what we just saw over these last few months was an actual Russian offensive. They just couldn't muster anything more than company-sized elements and slow grinds in a few areas. I do think there's a possibility of that. Often you'll hear folks say something along the lines of, just wait for the 300,000, or some asking, where are those 300,000 that were mobilized? I think the assumption there is that these are all people headed directly to the front, but in reality, the majority of those new recruits or reservists are likely in support position. In that case, the 300,000 have probably been contributing to the fight for months now. This is getting into the tooth-to-tail ratio, the concept that a military needs a certain number of people to support those doing the actual fighting. Back in World War II for the United States, it was 2.6 to 1, so more than 2 people in support for 1 person at the front. More recently for the U.S. in Iraq, that number was 8 to 1. So when the U.S. troops in country peaked at 168,000, only 18,000 or so were actual combat forces. It's on or about, I'm really, really bad at math. So even if we drop that down and say the Russian tooth to tail is 1 to 5, that means that out of the 300,000 mobilized, only 57,000 are in combat roles, with 243,000 in support, either in Russia or forward deployed in Ukraine. So why couldn't Russia break through with 300,000 new troops? Because it was only 57,000 troops spread across a 1,700-kilometer front from the Black Sea, Western Russia, and into Belarus. So it is possible this was all Russia had left, but I don't think so. There hasn't been the panic and rush for a follow-on mobilization that I would have expected if Russia was so severely depleted at the front that, a company-sized element is all they could muster. Instead, I think there's kind of some loss calculation going on inside of Russia. This current pace seems to be sustainable on the manpower and equipment front, at least for now, but a larger push could be more costly and burn out the overall force that much faster. So that kind of puts us back to where quite a few folks have predicted this war will go. Slow, grinding battles of attrition. We could still see major changes in territory, but those will be the exception rather than the norm for some time now. But that's all I got for now. We'll see y'all next time.